Hello, and welcome to the Regrettable Century. It's Jason and Chris, and we are presenting to you the introductory episode of Jason's side project with our friend Matthew.
With our France correspondent.
What is it called? Unbreakable Union. Which you will have heard us do an episode discussing. I think that was the last one we put out, right? Was the Unbreakable Union episode?
Yeah, that was the last regular episode.
Yeah, so this is the episode. It's going to be following our short conversation here. And Jason, you said you had a few things that you wanted to talk about before we played the episode. Why don't you go ahead and lead us off?
Okay, yeah. So this one that we're releasing is like the introduction episode. So it's not like our episode 1. It's like the way that we're doing it is that Matthew kicks off season 1, I'll kick off season 2, back and forth like that. But in listening to it, I thought, this is some stuff I would like to actually talk about as well. And so since we're going to tell people to listen to the podcast anyways, I thought this is a good excuse to basically talk about the same things because I missed out. So he said there are three topics that he wanted to kick off the show by discussing. And one of them was he told this anecdote about when he was I forget what age. He's older than I am.
Well, he's a year older than me, so he would have been about 11 when the Soviet Union fell.
Yeah, okay, that's right. Actually, he said he was 12.
Okay.
And he was talking about what the official end of the Soviet Union, the moment what it felt like and what it means. So I thought one thing I wanted to talk about was just this kind of the meaning at the end of the Cold War for us. I was in the first grade.
Yeah, I was in 5th grade.
And I didn't really think very much of it at the time because I kind of did because I kind of had some notion about the fact that there was a USSR and that they were the bad guys. They were our competitors. But even back then, even when I was like 6 years old, I didn't really think of them as in the same category as the Nazis.
Right.
Like I noticed that changing and kind of ramping up in the last 20 years. But in the early 90s, it was more like just a competitor. It was like we won the race. Like we beat but they really were not presented to us. Or at least I did not, as a 6-year-old, did not think of them in the same way as something evil. Even though like Ronald Reagan called them evil, it never really rang true.
So for me, my 5th grade class at our Christian school that we went to, we had weekly newspapers that were put out by our conservative Christian curriculum company called Abeka. Which, yeah. So we had these weekly. It's like 4-page, 2 pages front and back, so 4 pages of newspaper that were handed out to us, and we would read them every Friday and discuss the news articles in them. So I remember the collapse of the Soviet Union and actually watching it on TV, watching the fall of the Berlin Wall before that, and having everything kept up with on a weekly basis, and hearing about how freedom and democracy are prevailing, and how now the Soviets who had kept Christianity from being able to flourish were gone, and now there's going to be a revival of Christianity in Russia, stuff like that.
Man, actually, one of my very dear friends from around that time, who's I'm still good friends with today, his mom took a missions trip to Russia.
Oh yeah.
And I remember at the time, even asking her, I was like, I think everybody in Russia knows about Jesus. I even at that time, I had some conception of the Third Rome as a concept. I always thought it was a really silly kind of. I thought mission trips were for like going to places that are like far flung and ostensibly people who wouldn't know otherwise, or at least wouldn't that needed like whatever humanitarian projects done. Like you could go to the Amazon jungle and you could like help build a water mill or something. But Moscow,
a bridge.
You can't go to, like, what are you doing in Moscow? And I turned out the answer was talking about the real message of Christ, which is different than what they thought it was all this time. It's the one about, if you have a lot of money, that means God is looking favorably upon you.
Yeah, so 82% of the population of Russia is Christian, and 71% of those are Orthodox. So it's only 11% of Russia has the chance of being real Christians, though I imagine a lot of those are Catholics, so probably the percentage is a lot smaller than that. But
way fewer. Yeah.
The population of Americans that are Christian is 67%. So maybe, they should have gone on a mission trip to wherever they were.
Yeah. What about just a mission trip to like down the street?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to help poor people. We got a lot of them.
We certainly do. Probably
not.
Should
do a missions trip to Los Angeles with 80,000 homeless people and build there's lots of abandoned homes there, vacant homes there. We should just go to Beverly Hills and eject all of the people that live there and give those houses to the homeless.
That's a mission trip that I would support.
Yeah, me too.
Absolutely. To use the state to seize all wealth and capital from the hoarders, like the companies which own all the property. That's why that's why there are more homeowners in China than there are in the U.S. today.
It's funny that evil communist state has a better capitalist dream than the United States does.
Yeah, that's why Warren Buffett likes it.
They're on their way. They're on the ascendancy, and we're on the way out. As far as our arc is on the way down, as far as as civilization is concerned.
Yeah, and that actually kind of leads to the second thing that Matthew talked about, which I think is really, really interesting. He said that the world ceased to be beautiful. Basically, when we're talking about the reality of capitalist life in the absence of an ideological competitor,
right?
This liberalism and communism, they teamed up to defeat fascism, and then liberalism and communism competed with each other all throughout the rest of the century. And for the last 30 years, it's been liberalism triumphant. And so today, what we've been dealing with is, it's like a society eating itself.
I've heard it referred to as capitalism without a human face.
That's really good. It's terrible, but it's very apt.
And then there's also a meme I can describe for Kevin's enjoyment. It says, it's just a picture of Bill Clinton and Jeffrey Epstein, and it says capitalism's human face.
That's perfect. That's exactly right.
Yep.
Yeah. Speaking of capitalists or liberal society eating itself, and speaking of memes, this is also for you, Kevin. Lately, I've seen this one of it's like this guy saying, "I'm tired of lazy comparisons to Hitler." Trump is your Yeltsin, and it's just a picture of Boris Yeltsin making this very awkward kind of rich guy dance.
Yeah,
and then Trump doing the same thing. And I thought about like the USSR or the former USSR, especially Russia in the 90s, and I thought about like the existence of Doge and the slashing of, the closing of like thousands of social security offices and all the final gutting of any last vestige of the liberal welfare state. And I just thought like, yeah, the world is ceasing to be beautiful, because anything that's really, really that you could be proud of, you could feel good about in the U.S. was largely a consequence of having to make a good show of things, lest your population start being attracted to your competitor. and we don't have a competitor. So we don't. What do we have to be better at anybody than? What do we have to be good at?
Yeah, since there is no alternative, right? TINA, as they say. Then there is no. This is one of the iron laws of capitalism, right? Is that iron sharpens iron. Competition is good. It produces better products, right? And capitalism without a competitor just produces horse shit. And we're all dying under a gigantic mound of horse shit, suffocating.
It produces
us.
like a fictitious capital, memes, cryptocurrency, credit default swaps, all kinds of complicated financial instruments, but like nothing meaningful, nothing even, forget meaningful, even just nothing of substantial quality in terms of commodities. Like they're like little computers you carry around in your pocket that are designed to start breaking within a year.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's funny. And this is, Apple got sued by the EU and they had to remove all of their planned obsolescence built-ins, which is basically just software purposely making iPhones obsolete so people have to buy new ones. And you know, before that happened, I would get a new phone pretty much every 2 years, basically. As soon as it was paid off, I would get a new one, right? And then once they got rid of those the planned obsolescence features, I kept my same iPhone for almost. When did we go to Europe last?
2018.
2018? Okay, so I got it.
Yeah, that's a long time ago.
Yeah, I got it in 2018, right before we went to Europe, and I just replaced it a few months ago. So it's like, wow, if only if you regulate capitalism and you tell them to actually they have to make good products, then they are still capable of making products that work. They just don't have any incentive to do so.
Right. There's also the other side of this is the positive influence that such competition has on a world scale. Like, I started thinking about like the Arab Spring, but in a world in which there was a consistent ideological opponent of the U.S. or of Occupy Wall Street in a U.S. which was where there was a coherent ideological, philosophical, political alternative to your dashed expectations and your when you wake up from your dream, you're like, oh, what do we actually have? And we don't really have very much. And I just imagine like any of the number of crises, like from Trayvon Martin through the pandemic, COVID, all the way up to today with everything happening around the Trump administration. I just think about like what that all might feel like if there were some kind of alternative, some kind of different conception of how to address these problems presented in the world. Forget even if it's not the Soviet Union, although at least that one we don't have to imagine. We don't have to make it up in our heads because we know kind of what it was like and what it talked about, what it proposed. And I just thought like nothing is as clear as it once was.
Right. So when we talk about the competition of the Soviet Union, like with the United States or with the West, you know, we have that to thank for the existence of the welfare state, the hesitancy of the United States to involve itself in imperial adventures, right? Like after Vietnam, we were much more hesitant about getting involved in things. We did it more covertly, or we did it in our own backyard only, you know? And since that went away, the United States has been on a rampage just about doing whatever they want, pushing Russia to the brink of nuclear war, going so far as to, because they know they don't have a gigantic competitor in the Soviet Union anymore, they could just do whatever they want. The first imperial adventure that I would say is post-Soviet would be the Gulf War, which was engaged in as the Soviet Union was in the process of collapsing, right? Is in 1991. So the Soviet Union collapsed later on that year. Is that correct? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it was like
Gulf War was in
Christmas 1991 was when Yeltsin declared the end of the USSR, and Gulf War was
it's in 1990, so it was the year before, but it was as the Soviet Union was collapsing.
I mean, it was during a period when there was no relatively unified Politburo trying to decide how to counteract. It was like, how do we hold it together?
Right,
That's,
and it was like
in the era of the coup.
If I remember correctly, I think that the invasion of Iraq by the United States, or the attack on Iraq, the bombing campaign began in the fall. I remember thinking, like, oh, it'll be over by Christmas when I was a little kid, because I remember that happening still. I remember I paid a lot of attention to that. I would get the newspapers that our grandpa had, and they had little like fold-outs on the inside that would show, like, these are all of the different aircraft that the Iraqi army has, and these are all the different aircraft that the American army, that the coalition forces have, and these are their tanks. They were all in silhouette, and I had all those, and I was like following it really closely, kind of the way I am now with the Ukraine conflict. But yeah, so I guess it started in November. There we go, right? Anyway, it started in fall, and then it ended in February of 91.
So it happened. These are almost like simultaneous events. They happen concurrently.
Yeah, pretty much.
The Gulf War and the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and the birth of the post-Cold War era. They happened at precisely the same moment.
Right. Exactly. And so, like, then after that, there was the bombing of Serbia, which pissed off the Russians to no end, and killed, hundreds of civilians.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you could imagine the current Russian ruling circles being in the position that they're in without first going through the turmoil and the degradation of the 1990s,
right?
And also without the unchecked influence of the USA, and making everybody really mad.
Yeah. Well, and then of course there's the entire war on terror, which, interestingly enough, the Russian state helped in. You had sorties being flown out of former USSR territory into Afghanistan.
Yeah, that was Russia's last attempt to try to become a partner in whatever the world is going to be. Turns out that the ruling layers of this society, they know that we kind of need an opponent.
Oh, absolutely.
We can't just like run this society without opposition. We're trying to all the time. And that's why we need China to be the new USSR. But China just doesn't want to be the new USSR.
No, they're not. First of all, they're not antagonistic enough. China plays an extremely, extremely long game, and will only push as far as it's expedient for them to do so without upsetting the status quo. That's not good enough. So they need someone that's volatile enough to invade their neighbor, which China hasn't invaded a neighbor since it invaded Vietnam in 1979, I think. And that was in defense of an ally in Cambodia.
I mean, there's a reason why there are 40,000 U.S. troops being deployed right now to prepare for a possible war with Iran.
Right.
It's like which again, is just unthinkable in an era where half the world is if not pro-communist, at least Soviet sympathetic.
I don't mean to sound too conspiratorial here, but I always thought it was quite convenient that as soon as the United States pulled out of Afghanistan, all of a sudden the defense of Ukraine is an existential fight for the West that requires all of the United States's. Well, as it turns out, the United States has, up until probably Trump became president, run the whole war for Ukraine and funded and armed the whole war for Ukraine. And that's actually, the liberals admit this themselves. If you want to go look at, there's a New York Times article about how all of Ukraine's offensives and the strikes, that missile strikes, were all picked and approved of by the United States military. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, like, we've been looking for our new USSR ever since it collapsed, because the military industrial complex needs an existential threat in order to keep on justifying what it's doing. And like, and you know, Trump just announced a $1 trillion plans to pass a $1 trillion budget for the U.S. military, which it's got to be one of the dumbest fucking things I've ever heard in my life.
Well, but you have to create demand.
Yep.
So that you can have a corresponding supply. That's the way it actually works. Doesn't matter what they say.
You have to create the demand. Yeah, you have to make it necessary, because that's the whole point of supply side economics, right?
That's exactly right. And it's worked out. I was going to say it's worked out pretty well so far. It hasn't, but you know,
no, it hasn't.
It depends on who you ask. It has not worked out for the common people. It hasn't worked out for us. And also, in this corresponding way, ever since the end of the USSR and the end of the Cold War, and you know, whatever, the end of communism as a global threat or promise, depending on which vantage point from which you stand, we haven't really had anything to believe in, and kind of for a while. The New Atheist moment was our attempt to believe in not believing.
Yep.
And I think that went about as far as it can go, and it has part of the backlash. I think is really great, because it's a lot of people just rejecting that insufferable. What do you want to call this? Well, just whatever, being insufferable. But you know, nothing has taken the place. There's nothing that we can believe in. That's why, I mean, we talk about this all the time.
Yeah.
If you talk to anybody who was, they're like college age adults born after 9/11 now, which is
depressing.
It is depressing. I just didn't really appreciate what this was like when I was a kid. But now as an old guy, I'm like, kids today, man. But the thing is, I mean, obviously I'm doing a thing which everybody does when they get to a certain age. But I also think this is a new moment where we have the first generation born in kind of a long time that has no expectations for anything in the future. Like, it's not the Republic. It's not a homestead. It's not, you know, you're not going to go to war toward end slavery. You're not going to build the railroads. You're not going to
go to war to defeat fascism.
Right. There's no space race to win. There's no competitor. There's nothing at all to believe in. The last thing we had to believe in was disbelief. And that lasted for a few years. And we got tired of it really quickly because it's very unfulfilling.
Right. And just look at the tepid response to like of what most liberals consider to be like a takeover of fascism and the existential threat to the American system. And look at how tepid the response to it has been. They can't even believe in opposing a president that's doing heinous things.
Yeah, like I went and checked out one of these Stop Tesla, what are these anti-Trump resistance moments? And it was, on the one hand, it was nice to see like, oh, this is a return to being out engaging with anybody on any, whatever. Right. It kind of reminded me of the anti-Bush years. But on the other hand, it was like, damn, this reminds me of the anti-Bush years. It's like,
right.
What is it that we actually are trying to accomplish? What do we want to happen? And if you ask anybody, what they want to happen is we're going to go back to normal because that's what we believe in. It's just not very, first of all, it's not possible. It doesn't fill any of the void in your soul. Yeah. What might we hope for nowadays? Like,
well, Comrade G, come save us.
Yeah. Like,
I mean, that's a sort of a pale echo of a hope that China's gonna be like, oh yeah, by the way, we've been building socialism this whole time and flip the switch, and then the global revolution begins. But
yeah, we've just been doing it in secret.
It's actually just new economic policy that we're done with now, and it's time for global socialism.
Even in that scenario, though, like, what about everybody else?
Yeah.
Or is that when the sleeper cells?
That's when the sleeper cells pop up. Okay, so hey, I don't discount the fact that China thinks that they're doing a elongated new economic policy and really has a plan to build socialism. So don't come for me, all right? I just think that it's a Chinese project and it doesn't have anything to do with global socialism.
Right, and I do think that's a major difference. I was going to say a major difference in the world communist movement. There's no such thing, which is it's a real bummer of a note to end on.
Well, don't we have the third thing to talk about? Or did we do all of them?
That was the third thing.
Was it? Damn.
What might we hope to accomplish? What might we hope for nowadays? Then I put a rebirth, salvage, like a new version of this thing, but based on the bits that worked. An exact copy, or just a rebirth is just, which I think is what a lot of people actually imagine that they are trying for. Not so much trying for, but posturing about. Or is it something entirely new? And I honestly, I guess that's kind of what that is in the back of my mind. That's a question that I'm constantly trying to think through, not just with every episode of the Regrettable Century, but every episode of Unbreakable Union. As I go through and look at the questions and the answers and the propositions made by people facing these questions. Are there ways that we could conceive of in the future based upon attempts from the past? And I guess I have to be hopeful about that, because there's nothing else that I can see about which to be hopeful, like at all.
Well, I don't know how either, and I don't know how to really hope for something like that. But I do know that we have at least a few good seasons of podcasts about the Soviet Union to look forward to. And without further ado, here you go. The introductory episode of Unbreakable Union.
Welcome to Unbreakable Union, a podcast which covers the history of the Soviet Union from its founding in 1922 to its dissolution in 1991. Introductions. My name is Matthew, and I live in France. My co-host Jason lives in Texas. We would like to introduce this podcast by speaking about 3 moments. The first is an anecdote from my personal history, really one of my first political conversations. In 1991, when I was 9 years old and Jason was 6, I was sitting in the back seat of my friend's family car at a gas station in Tomball, Texas. The Christmas season had just ended, and in a sudden spasm of street protests, the Soviet Union had become a thing of the past. It had been swept into the same dustbin that it had prepared for Western capitalist societies that it was built to depose. So I remember my friend's father, who was the pastor at a local church, giving an impromptu history lesson from the front seat of the car, celebrating the strengths of capitalist democracy and its triumph over the Soviet Union. Now bear in mind that I was in the 5th grade, but I'd already had an intense attraction to the subject of history and world events. I could remember, for example, the Soviet-Afghan War, and seeing news clips of long lines for out-of-stock Soviet butcher shops, and had at least a decent sense of what it meant to live in the first, second, or third world. So, feeling my oats, I posed a challenge. What about Cuba and China? What about the millions of people in the world who still identify as communists, or live under communist regimes? It seems to me, I said, that communism has only taken a step back. To which my friend's father handily replied, "Well, Matthew, it's a pretty big step." So if I had to say where my fascination with the Soviet world began, I'd place the beginning there, precisely, as it were, at the end. Second, in her 2021 novel, Beautiful World, Where Are You?, Sally Rooney's characters declare that the world ceased to be beautiful after the fall of the Soviet Union. Rooney, the author behind the breakout success Normal People, is a self-professed Marxist whose characters reify class dynamics in their personal relationships, or, in the case of Beautiful World, extrapolate their ideals and disappointments of the world in a set of written personal exchanges. Third, In 2005, Vladimir Putin, president of the Russian Federation, identified the collapse of the Soviet Union as, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. His statement was widely castigated in the press, not least of all because it demoted other 20th century catastrophes to second tier. Further, the line was touted to belie Putin's true identity as a world leader with designs on re-establishing the lost Soviet empire. This history of the Soviet Union is premised on the notion that the themes of the previous statements are true, that the fall of the Soviet Union was a geopolitical catastrophe, that communism took a big step back, and that somehow the world is less beautiful without it. Yes, we think that the collapse of the Soviet Union was indeed a geopolitical catastrophe unequaled in the 20th century. And we could indeed reach back to the fall of Rome to find parallels appropriate in their scope to the calamity that befell the former Soviet republics. If John Reed's allegory that the founding of the socialist state in Russia shook the world, the collapse of that same state less than 3/4 of a century later brought Eastern Europe, Russia, and Eurasia to their knees. What's more, the long reverberations of this calamity can still be felt in the enduring crises of the world today. As opposed to the liberation of Europe from the Nazis in the 1940s, that other bête noire of the 20th century, the implosion of the Soviet Union did not yield any markers to demonstrate that we were on the right path of history. No camps, for example, were liberated, the gulags having long since been liquidated by the Soviets themselves, and the hallmarks of an evil empire seemed curiously lacking. Meanwhile, the relief that the international community felt at the prospect of a de-escalated arms race was replaced by the nagging worry as to the security of the former Soviet nuclear arsenal. The demise of the Soviet Union did not result in a reversal of the social and economic miseries that beset the Soviet populations in the 1970s and 80s. Rather, it intensified them. As Levi's shops and McDonald's restaurants encamped on the periphery of Red Square, grift and wanton criminality in government became standard, as former state enterprises were auctioned off to the highest or most connected bidder. The flood of Western goods and the scrapping of the social safety net, that is, the application of the Washington Consensus, were as close as former Soviet citizens got to anything resembling a Marshall Plan that rehabilitated the economies of Europe and Asia following the Second World War. Consequently, unemployment, already a perennial anxiety under the Soviet system, skyrocketed. In Russia, suicide rates linked to rampant alcoholism peaked at 41.4 people for every 100,000 persons in 1995. One thinks of Bert Kreischer's top-free recount of mafia-run trains in post-Soviet Russia, or Louis C.K.'s hilariously miserable bit about glue-toting Russian teenagers in the Yeltsin era to get a sense, albeit blackly humorous, of the calamity and misery that engulfed the precincts of the Soviet Union in the years immediately following its collapse. Yes, we agree with Sally Rooney's character that the world at large has indeed shown itself to be somehow less beautiful in the 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. To be clear, we, the authors of this podcast, have no nostalgia for the Soviet epoch that we barely knew, and only as children at that. Neither of us identify the Soviet Union as the most articulate and complete human society offered up in the annals of extant history, nor any more pine for the threat of nuclear annihilation, stagnant economies, total arts and sciences, etc. However, the Soviet Union, even in its most dilapidated forms, spurred the world towards self-improvement. We take, for example, the construction of the social states of Western Europe, the anti-colonial struggles in the so-called Third World, the end of apartheid in South Africa, among other significant events as decisive world historic moments in which the Soviet Union's positive influence can be directly or indirectly felt. Even germane to the milieu of the United States, a deeply conservative society by global standards, the civil rights movement, the space race, or even the United States' self-conception as the city on a hill, speak to the United States' deep-rooted need to prove itself as better than in the presence of the Soviet Union. Lastly, yes, that capitalism triumphed over the Soviet system is a fact. Our query here is that if democracy triumphed over communism, where did democracy go? In a post-Soviet world of ungirdled neoliberalism, one that triumphed over the undemocratic practices of the Soviet Empire, we find that democratic rights across the globe are in full retreat. In an epoch where the sole motivation in life has been reduced to the pursuit of money, wealth inequality has escalated to unprecedented levels, rendering wealth itself either virtually impossible for most of the world's inhabitants or psychologically and socially debilitating for those few who have it, either by means of vicious exploitation or by having inherited it via the world's arcane inheritance and property laws, or both. Our cities have abated their roles as nuclei of culture and are hubs for cheap employment for workers who can barely afford to live in their suburbs. Meanwhile, the rich whom they serve spend their time in pursuit of the next high, be it chemical or otherwise, rendering cities as their own private playgrounds, or to the rest of us, colorless urban landscapes where one can show contempt to a Starbucks barista without facing any consequences. In the benumbing repetitiveness of banal labor, time itself has become stagnant. The long now, no longer a means to a historical destination, has somehow become its own cue for meat at a butcher shop that is out of stock. In these contexts is an evaluation of a society that had at its core an ideological vision purported to deliver us from this destiny not called for. Yes, communism was defeated, decisively. But we should say, in deference to my 9-year-old self, not definitively. Or more specifically, communism as a model for state and economic development, paralyzed by a series of crises, was swept away by a sequence of internal nationalist movements that might otherwise have borne no significance. Here again, in a world staggering under the weight of interminable armed conflicts, as well as financial crises, compounded by health crises and environmental collapse, lacking any sense of a clear way forward, we might also find ourselves in the shoes of the erstwhile apparatchiks, dancing nauseatingly close to the edge of the dustbin. In this sense, the cliché phrase, a warning from history, that has so stickily and clumsily been hung around the neck of a myriad of concurrent political phenomenon, takes a fuller meaning, that the terms of our demise may have already been set in motion. That is to say, that instead of fretting that the monsters of our collective past might find a way to leap out at us again, the source of our demise might be altogether more banal and well-seeming, and we are really only waiting for the slightest nudge from an otherwise inconsequential or even risible source to send us plummeting. To borrow a line from Mikhail Bulgakov's novel Master and Margarita, it may well be that Anushka has already bought the sunflower oil, and has not only bought it, but has already spilled it. Beginning with its origins in the Russian social democratic movement, this history will trace the course of the Soviet Union from its inception as a loci of global transitional economics, to its internal transition into a traditional state form, to its economic gyrations from liberalization, consumerism, to stagnation, and ultimate defeat as an inert and superfluous state. All lives are victims of their time and place. In the Soviet Union's, brief as it was no exception. In Susan Buck Morris's terms, what began as a conquest of time was exchanged for a war of space, and in the end was defeated without either. We intend here to trace that arc. Our objective is to create foremost a popular social history of a nation and not of individuals. History is a study of the collective activities that have thrust individuals onto the world stage. That is to say, with apologies to Winston Churchill, it is the mass activity of the world's populations that dictate the lives of individuals, and not the lives of individuals that dictate the activity of the world's populations. For example, we see the Soviet Union as a product of the socialist labor movement in Russia, and not as the personal project of Lenin or Stalin. Likewise, we see economics as a mass phenomenon, rather than a scheme emanating from the Kremlin desks of Brezhnev or Gorbachev. And though countering global perspectives can be distilled into titular competitors such as Kennedy and Khrushchev, personalities alone cannot carry the burden of history. We do not intend to indict the Soviet Union for its crimes. Cold War historians have already done this to such excess as to render any further denigration of its record or rehashing the behavior of its punitive organs as intellectually spurious, if not contemptuous. If one wants a two-dimensional recount of cartoonish Soviet villainy, we can recommend without hesitation Armando Iannucci's Death of Stalin. When one considers the fates of black and indigenous people in North America, or colonial subjects in Ireland, India, and the Philippines, and we can go on, one must conclude that absolutely no state project of the modern age is guiltless of the most horrendous crimes. Or in the words of the French revolutionary Antoine Saint-Just, on ne peut point régner innocemment. Le folion est trop évident. We are content to leave it at that. A note on content. Each episode follows a format of an introduction, a presentation either by myself or Jason, a musical interlude, and a discussion on the subject of the episode. This first season is intended to cover the first several years of the Soviet Union, from its founding in 1922, 3, and 4, to the end of the inter-party conflict in 1929. We've also included 2 supplementary episodes, one on the Russian revolutionary tradition and the other on the Russian Revolution and Civil War. Jason and I are both academically trained. We hold degrees in history as well as political science and anthropology. Jason's even studied a little Russian. That is to say, we are endowed with some skill, and this endeavor is not purely amateur. But Unbreakable Union also draws on our youths when we thought our responsibilities encompassed the earth and everything that lived on it. On time spent in activist circles studying the Soviet experience, particularly, and alas regrettably, often limited to strictly its early revolutionary form. We can also call on experiences in and out of the labor movement in the United States, of seeing history made firsthand by people from the fabric of their own lives. We also benefit from our own personal readings, when, for example, we would arrive at work with a well-worn copy of E.H. Carr under our arms, to be taken up during that shift's 30-minute lunch break. Lastly, we want to acknowledge our time spent in conversation with the inimitable Chicago author and all-around institution, Joe Allen, to whom we are both personally and intellectually indebted. This is shaping up into a large project, with all kinds of perils related to facts, perspectives, and not least of all, pronunciation. In advance, we claim all errors as our own, and if made aware of them, we will endeavor to make prompt amends. Thank you very much.